All right, guys, so I just saw Dune Part 2. I'm ready for a review. I'm wearing my ducal signet ring. I've got my Chris knife. I'm ready to break it down for you. So may thy knife chip and shatter.
Behold, my stuff.
All right, so the first thing I want to put out there is that obviously I've got the ring, I've got the knife. I am a fan of visually what they've done with this Dune. I am very positive on anything that brings a property that I like to the masses. I am a big fan of the books, even the weird ones. I'm talking God Emperor through Chapter House. I am a fan of Brian Herbert's interpretations. Paul of Dune was actually something that was really interesting to me, and it looks like they're going to slip into that a little bit. So I'm a fan of Dune. I like that Denis' version was so well received. It's going to bring Dune to the masses. If I was going to rate Dune, it would be in a very different context. So let me just start off by saying I enjoyed movie one. Movie two is infinitely better in terms of enjoyability. I think in terms of just a movie from start to finish, there was so much more going on. Movie one was really book one of Dune's first novel. The first novel of Dune was broken into three books: book one, book two, book three. Movie two is a combination of the final two pieces. So whereas it could have been a trilogy, it makes movie two really boring. And if you want to know what that would kind of look like, I encourage you to watch the 2000 miniseries from the Sci-Fi Channel, not SYFY, SCIFI, back before it got switched, back when they made good sci-fi. That, to me, is the definitive novel version of Dune as a live action. If you want to know what the novel really was trying to drive, watch the miniseries. And because they didn't have an effects budget, because it was television, it was very much like a play. And so it was focused on the plot and the characters, not so much the effects. And that I really, really enjoyed. It was sort of like Dune Shakespeare. It was broached that way. And then, of course, a lot of people, you remember there was just recently, not too many years ago, a clamoring for the, I don't even know what they call them, non-fungible tokens, NFTs, of Jodorowsky's Dune, which you couldn't do. Jodorowsky's Dune designs, a lot of those made it into the sci-fi show. So I think that is the definitive version that Frank Herbert would like to watch. It'd be like, oh, they read my book and they understood the assignment. Having said that, Frank Herbert did not like 1984's Dune. He liked what it was on paper. He liked what it was when they were producing it. And then when they cut it and made it what it was, he did not like it. There are some people out there who will say differently. They'll only have the interviews during production where he was very supportive of it. But the interviews he gave after, and there were very few, were very negative. He did not like the movie that came out from David Lynch. He said it completely missed the point of Dune. I do think that happened a little bit with Denis' version for a similar reason, but he did a much better job in it. Having said that, I feel that these two movies are Dune Light or Diet Dune, if you will. It cuts out a lot of the intelligence of Dune and really dumbs it down to it's like a reduction. It's a distilled, thick, pasty version of what Dune was when it was this big giant broth of stuff and so many ingredients. They really sort of distilled it down to the basics. And so that makes it very palatable for the entire world to enjoy Dune. And if this is your version of Dune, great. Like I said, anything that brings Dune to the masses and make people appreciate Dune a little bit, all about it. And I liked it. I thought it was a great movie. I thought it was a really entertaining movie. It was engaging. The acting was really good. But that does not mean it was a loyal movie. It means that it was a good movie. And it doesn't have to be loyal to be good. For example, I love the TV show Lucifer. I think Lucifer is super great, even though it's essentially Castle. It is not Neil Gaiman's The Sandman, even though that is what the characters are lifted from and the names and the relationships are loosely from that. It's its own thing, but it's based on adapting Neil Gaiman's Lucifer. Having said that, I love the show Lucifer, but I wouldn't say, oh, it's Neil Gaiman's Lucifer from The Sandman. I would never describe it as that. That's kind of the way I feel about Dune. Denis Villeneuve basically decided he wanted to make Apocalypse Now again and use Dune. And that's kind of what we got, especially in the first movie. The Baron, Vladimir Harkonnen, is a complete miss. Stellan Skarsgård even said reading the novel Dune did not prepare him for his role in any way, shape, or form, because virtually nothing of that character was used. He's witty, he's funny, he's over the top, he has grandeur. He's extremely intelligent, and he's extremely loquacious. He likes to tell people, he likes to play games with them because he's very upset about being fat, which is Helena Mohayim. That's her fault. It's the Reverend Mother's fault, but that's a whole separate issue. So I think that was a big sticking point for a lot of us with 1. The Apocalypse Now shot-for-shot remake issues were a sticking point for us. The loss of things like the espionage and the dinner scene and all that was a big sticking point for us. No navigators was a big sticking point for a lot of us. And you kind of don't understand why the spice matters on any level. It doesn't matter. It's like a throwaway one sentence. And so nobody gives a shit about the spice because it doesn't explain anything. So where there were some loyalty things, they were loyalty for the sake of loyalty. They weren't loyalty to drive a plot, which the miniseries very much makes all those things matter the way the book does. So I feel like a lot of people were kind of iffy on 1 in terms of loyalty. They were like, I don't know if he's going to nail it with 2. So much is missing from 1. A lot of stuff's not going to matter. Well, 2 was just a great movie. It really was. And don't get me wrong, I don't dislike watching 1 at all. But 2 is a really good movie. Like, just, it's a good movie no matter how you want to dice it, whether it's an adaptation, whether it's not an adaptation. Good character arc, good plot arc, good story, good pace. Even at 2 hours and 45 minutes, it's a good movie. And so, I absolutely encourage you to watch it. But as I said, it's Diet Dune. It's not Dune. If Denis Villeneuve's Dune was a book report, like in school when you were a kid, you had to do a book report, and you had to write down what was the explanation of the book, what was the author trying to say, describe the important parts of the book to your teacher so that they get that you grasped Dune, right? If Denis Villeneuve's films were a book report, which they're not, they're just an attempt to make a really engaging film, which he did, but if they were a book report, it's like a C+. And there's a couple reasons why. I think his version of Dune works with a modern audience really well. In 2024, his Dune works, and his changes work, and because it's not overly complicated, people can digest it, feel they grasp it, and feel the epicness of the shots, and be happy. But it's not what Frank Herbert wrote. Frank Herbert, and you have to remember this about Frank Herbert. Frank Herbert wrote this in the 60s. And this was very much an allegorical story. Unlike Tolkien, and this is where a lot of Tolkien fans will bump into things, Tolkien isn't allegorical. It does not reflect modern society. Tolkien actually hated allegory. He strongly was against fantasy writing being allegorical. It should just be your life experiences create what he called his stock, and then you create something that's completely its own thing and has nothing to do with reflecting modern society. Well, that's great for Professor Tolkien, who liked to live apart from reality in many ways. That was not Frank Herbert. As an American author, Frank Herbert, before he wrote Dune, he was writing speeches for McCarthy during McCarthyism, which was the big witch hunt for communism in America. And so it became this sort of reflection of how charismatic leaders can use fear and blind loyalty to take power and move nations and turn the world into this giant chess piece. The Cold War was becoming a thing, and we had scares with all different forms of communism in different places coming out of World War II. He saw and witnessed the rise of charismatic leaders like Hitler and like Stalin and like Mussolini. And, when he was writing speeches for McCarthy, it was very much a witch hunt for charismatic leaders. And so Paul Muad'Dib sort of fills that role. The biggest mistake anyone could make with Dune is thinking that Paul Atreides is the hero. Paul is not the hero. Paul is the cautionary tale. Paul is the lesson that if you are a charismatic leader, you can only accomplish your goal. If you're so laser focused on achieving one thing, as a charismatic leader, you will compromise on your morals and your principles to the point where you seek absolute power and you destroy more than you help. And this is ultimately articulated by the fact that Paul does not choose the golden path. He sees the golden path, but he's afraid to do it. And that responsibility falls to his second son, Leto II. So Paul is not a hero. You like Paul, but you should feel sorry for Paul. You should pity Paul. And by the end of Dune Messiah, if you don't pity Paul, you fucking miss the assignment completely. Even by the end of Dune, you kind of feel a little bad for Paul because it cost him so much. That's really important. And I don't think Denis completely missed that. He transferred that outlook to Chaney, which is a bit of an issue for me because it did destroy Chaney's character in a big way. And that brings me to my second sticking point, which is Paul's an extremely likable guy in these movies, and just like 1984, he's the hero. Although Denis does make him a bit of an anti-hero, which I was very happy about. But the problem also is Dune, in addition to being an espionage novel, which is completely wiped out of Denis' version, Dune is a allegorical reflection of gender norms in society. That is fucking gone from Denis' version. He completely missed the boat on that. And that sucks because it sets up so much. He still had a lot of the mentalities that came about, but he didn't have the cause and the why behind it. And that was bothersome. So some of the whys that he didn't have that bugged me. Number one is, this is why we had a problem with Liette Kynes being female. Chaney has a line where she says, Fremen are equal, men and women alike. That is bullshit. The Fremen were based on Arabic society where there is an extreme patriarchy. Women were not equal to men in Frank Herbert's Dune. In fact, women were oppressed in every society of Frank Herbert's Dune. It was very, very prominent. And because, like, in the Fremen, in the Council of Naibs, there are women there. The women are not allowed to be Naibs of Asich in Frank Herbert's Dune. Chaney had a position of power because her father was Liette. Liette was he was the steward of Gondor. He was the leader of the Fremen until the Mahdi came. So, he was very much like a Denethor character, but he was secret. He hid himself. So the name Liette was secret and hidden. And Dr. Kynes was an imperial ecologist. So it was sort of like a Clark Kent Superman situation where everybody knew that the problem before the Harkonnens were dealing with crap from Liette and they didn't know who Liette was. They said he's the man who may not even exist. He's the man who may be many men. Liette's like a myth. And Liette's whole thing as a planetary ecologist was, having seen other worlds, he knew what Arrakis could be. And if it wasn't for this damn obsession with the useless spice, Arrakis would be a paradise. And they do touch on that a little bit in the first movie. They talked about how they were going to terraform Arrakis, and then when they discovered the spice, they stopped all that and left the desert alone. And the Fremen were like, well, that's bullcrap, we want a paradise. Well, the problem is they didn't tell you why the spice was important. And we'll get to that. But Liette being a man allowed him to be a leader, and Stilgar and Liette are brothers. And so that is a huge connection that's lost, because Chaney is Stilgar's niece. That respect, that family aspect was missing in Denis Villeneuve's situation. And because Chaney was the daughter of Liette, she was offered a certain amount of latitude that other women did not have, both as a Fremen, as a fighter, as a lot of different things. The other thing was that she became a Sayadina. Much like they made Jessica a Sayadina, and then Jessica becomes the Reverend Mother, just in case a Reverend Mother dies, they consecrate a new Sayadina, and Chaney was the one who stepped up and became Sayadina. So she became like a spiritual leader, which put her directly under Jessica's tutelage, and that was a source of conflict for them. Which, it was not rocky in the sense like they hated each other like they did in this movie. There was just a bit of that sort of mother-in-law, you're not a Fremen, and your Reverend Motherness is skewed by this shit you're pushing on Paul, and it's crap, and I don't like it. But she very much believed in the Mahdi, and she believed in Liette's vision for Arrakis. And she said, fuck the spice, we don't need this crap, let's make it a paradise. The whole thing that Chaney loved about Muad'Dib was he was so very singularly focused on his goal, much the same way Liette was. He saw the vision of Liette, and he embraced that vision when a lot of other Fremen didn't. And that was something that meant a great deal to her. It was, oh, the vision of Liet, the paradise. And that was her big thing with him. She was fiercely loyal to him. This bullshit where she pissed off and fucks off at the end of the movie, not Chaney at all. That's what the audience is supposed to feel like. But doing that to Chaney really didn't sit with me at all. So the Fremen Society, again, oppressing women, Paul elevated Chaney and said, she is my equal. She is my wife is the wrong term. She was sort of like the concubine, but in the same way that Jessica was to Leto. But like in the movie, Paul asks, "What's her secret name?" That was the nickname that he called her. No one else called her that. He called her that. That was his loving name for her. And so Paul actually got a little gun shy about the union with Irulan, and it was actually Chaney's fierce support that this needed to happen, and her confidence that Paul would be hers and this would be a marriage in name only. That's what really made Paul go through with it. And this is the opposite. She didn't even know. And so that was really problematic for me too, because I feel like they just completely missed the Chaney character. I feel like they understood that she had to have a fierce loyalty to her people. She was the voice of the Fremen for the audience in the ways that Stilgar wasn't, but it just didn't pan out for me. So I think they really blew it with Chaney. So that's really the gender roles of the Fremen. The gender roles in the Landsraad, dukes, counts, people of authority. There were no queens, really, at all. Women were ornamental. Women were chess pieces moved to create unions of the houses to stem off war. When the Reverend Mother says you were supposed to have a daughter, not a son, to Jessica, that was partially because the daughter was supposed to be wed to Fade Rautha to potentially produce the Kwisatz Haderach for them, but also end the feud between Harkonnen and Atreides before they kill each other and preventing the loss of both bloodlines. The Reverend Mother did not support the eradication of the Atreides bloodline. That was not a thing that the Bene Gesserit wanted. They wanted the Atreides bloodline because they felt it was a key ingredient to producing the Kwisatz Haderach. And same with the Harkonnen bloodline. But they had secretly taken a Harkonnen and bedded Leto with that because they wanted to have that experiment, because they had just had one that came very, very close with Hasmir Fenring, but he ended up being sterile and he fell short. He was a failed Kwisatz Haderach. And that's shown in the book when Hasmir Fenring shows up and Paul is looking at everybody and he can see everybody's history and everybody's past, like he does in the film when he's talking to the Council of Naibs. He can't see Hasmir Fenring. Hasmir Fenring is a black hole to him. He's like, there's a shadow there. I can't read. Who is that? And they go, oh, that's Count Fenring. He goes, one of the failed Kwisatz Haderachs. Like, he knew who Fenring was. And that made Fenring a very dangerous man. Fenring's wife is in the movie. Fenring is not. And that's another problem that I have. Because I think that you take away the Bene Gesserit aspect. Now, again, the gender norms of the Landsraad are women have no power. Women have no power. Men have power. So how does a woman obtain power? The Bene Gesserit are the answer to that. The Bene Gesserit are the foil to women not having authority. They work behind the scenes. They don't get the title, and they don't get to stand in front and say, I rule here, but they control the men who do. The Bene Gesserit figure out how to control men, how to use, exploit men's sexual depravity and their ravenousness for sexual activity. And that is ultimately the thing that Frank is trying to say, that this is what we've forced women to be. Women are not whores. They've used the only tools men have left them to control them. And that is maximized later in the books by the Honored Matre. And they are just total sex demons that control men with that power. So women controlling men through those desires and pleasures and things like that, that is sort of a forced scenario for the Bene Gesserit. It's not something that they actually chose. They didn't have a choice because they can't physically stand against men, so they must use what is at their disposal. They develop the voice. They also develop techniques of fighting called the Weirding Way that is completely gone in this movie. And again, I don't know why. They fucked it up in 1984 with the weirding module, which was so stupid. But Bene Gesserit's mastery of their body chemistry. They could control their muscles, their breathing. They have the ability to break down poison, which Paul does bring up, that Bene Gesserit's learned this. But their ability to move very quickly and activate strength when they need it in spurts. That's the weirding way. And men are not supposed to be taught it because women are protecting their advantages that they have developed to control men. The whole point of not teaching men is you don't want to give this power to men. This is how we control men. This is our answer to men being prick oppressors. And so Paul learning it was this big fucking nightmare because they were like, you can't teach this to a man. This is the whole reason we do this. What is wrong with you, Jessica? And so Paul then gives that to the Fremen and completely throws everything. Like, oh my God, he gave the weirding way to an entire nation of people who are already good warriors. Like, we're so screwed. It was this big, giant thing that Paul just said, screw it, I'm teaching. And Jessica was the one who really started it. And so as much as Paul is the charismatic leader, it was really Jessica who put all this in motion. And that was somewhat reflected in Denis' version, but not really to the extent it should have been. What gave them value to the Fremen was not just the myth of the Lisan al-Gaib, it was the weirding way and made them better fighters and made them able to stand against the Sardaukar and be this unstoppable force. And just taking all the rules of engagement and throwing it out the windows. The Landsraad had an agreement about no atomic. So Paul using the atomics was like, dude, you can't use atomics. What's wrong with you? It's a violation of the CHOAM agreements. And, you know, Paul has this famous line where he says, CHOAM is void where Muad'Dib walks. Because he didn't give a fuck. He was like, all rules of warfare are out. Whatever it takes to win. I don't care. I will sacrifice every bit of morality I have to win. The ends will justify the means. And he knew that that would bring on the war. And so he knew the Landsraad would never accept him as leader. He knew that once he got the Emperor to bow and he controlled spice production, everyone would have to accept him, but they wouldn't really, and it would take physical force to drive everyone into obedience so that they wouldn't turn around and blow him up. And his people would never be free and safe as long as the Landsraad was a threat, and that was why his crusade went across the nation. He also knew that once he whipped the Fedaykin into a religious frenzy, he had to point them somewhere off of Arrakis, or eventually it would lead to civil war. And he knew he could not have that. So that was the other reason why he was hesitant to do what he did in some way, because he knew what the price would be. So again, the gender norms, both with the Fremen and with the Landsraad, force the hands of why these groups exist and why they behave the way they do, and why, you know, Irulan was, for all her and her sister were, they weren't sons. There were no heirs, so they didn't really matter. They were secondhand citizens, you know. When the Emperor in the film says, you'll make a fierce empress, there would be no empress. That's not a thing. And so again, that sort of knowing that these women, they did not have any value except for the male children they would bear, it was really important in Frank's books because it showed the dangers of segregating society in that way, because ultimately it leads to this dichotomy where we can't be a united people. I didn't think that that needed to come out. I think that that could have been really important. And by taking that out, it sort of beckons the question of why. You know, why do these things exist? Why are the emperors truthsayers? Why don't they just rule? Why don't they usurp? You know, because if they have the ability for women to rule, then what the frig do you need the emperor for? It just kind of, it took away the forced shackles of the society and the reason for all the behind-the-scenes chess. If everybody can rule and be up front, then what's the point of the behind-the-scenes? Just do it up front. If you have the voice and you could sit on the throne as a woman and people will accept that, then what the hell are you doing? Use the voice, take over, problem solved, Bob's your uncle, Fanny's your aunt, there's no conflict at all, the Reverend Mothers rule. So the fact that that didn't happen, we don't know why they don't just do that. The movie opens that door in a very bad way. Frank's version tells you why that can't be. So that brings us back to the Landsraad, right? All the great houses were afraid of getting pooped on. But the reason the Landsraad, and the Landsraad is basically like Congress. It's like NATO, or the United Nations, if you will. All the great houses have leaders that sit on the council, and they all vote on how shit goes in the universe. And they have the Padishah Emperor, who's their emperor. But is he, though? I mean, the emperor rules with an iron fist because he has the Sardaukar. He had a planet, Seleucus Secundus, which was this harsh, rainy, nasty planet, which hardened criminals. It was like a prison planet, and it hardened the criminals to make the perfect warriors, which very much was what Arrakis did with the Fremen. And so Paul saw the Emperor's army and was like, I can do that with Arrakis. And that's what made the Emperor so dangerous, the Carino Emperor, was because he had access to the Sardaukar. And so the Landsraad couldn't vote him out or move against him because he'd do what he did to the Atreides. He'd wipe them out. And so that fear is kind of what held everybody in check. But in order to keep them subdued, he had to make sure that spice quotas were met and spice was evenly distributed among the great houses. But he couldn't really control that as the Emperor. The Guild controlled that. And so without the Guild's okay, ships don't go across the universe. They can't. The Holtzman engines fold space and allow them to travel, but you'll bounce through a supernova, like Han Solo said. You just crash. The only way to navigate folded space was with a Guild navigator. A Guild navigator was, believably, a human who had taken so much damn spice and lived so long in a cloud of spice that they basically turned into giant fish people who had this unbelievable foresight and predictability that they could navigate the trip and see everything that would happen and pick the right way that'll prevent you from getting killed. And so that is how ships travel through space. That means if you rule Caladan, all of your economy is based on Caladan unless you can trade with the other great houses. So now your value all of a sudden is based on these other worlds. And so the entire society's value and power and economies are based on interstellar travel. Without the spice creating the navigators need a constant source of spice or they go blind. They lose their power. It's not sustainable like the Kwisatz is. And as a result of that, the Guild had this stranglehold on the Landsraad. It was, you get to be the Landsraad as long as we say. But nobody liked that. The Bene Gesserit didn't like that. Nobody liked the fact that the Guild had this stranglehold on interstellar commerce and basically had the entire Landsraad by the balls, including the Emperor, which did make him a little bit of a pawn of the Guild. And so Paul threatening to destroy spice production is a problem. The other thing the spice did was it made you live longer. And it made you look young. The Emperor was supposed to look 30 years old, even though he was 87. So, like, this is a thing where everybody wants to live longer and not die, so the spice is very, very important. The Fremen don't give a shit about any of that. They don't care. They just don't want to live in a miserable desert, or so they thought. And so when Paul says, I'll destroy spice production, he did say in the movie, he who controls a thing, who could destroy a thing truly controls a thing. That's true. He's like, I can blow up the spice, never leave Arrakis again, and live out my life happily with my lady here and not give a shit. All right, the rest of the houses can go rot. I don't care. That was what made Paul dangerous, and that was what made everybody nervous, because he didn't have a desire to rule the universe. He just wanted to make them fuck off. And so that made everybody super nervous, and the Guild knew he could do it. And they were like, basically, the Emperor did not want to subjugate his throne, or abdicate his throne, but the Guild was like, if he threatens spice production, and he tells us to the Guild tells this to the Reverend Mother, if he threatens to do this, we have to let it happen. The spice must flow. They knew Paul would take over as Emperor and that this would happen, but they had to let it happen because they couldn't afford the fact that he would nuke all the spice. There was another thing that really bugged me. He said he would do it with atomics. That wouldn't destroy the spice. Why? The movie fails to tell you that the spice is worm shit, for lack of a better term. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but basically giant worms poop in their nests of the young sand trout, and that comes up, does a spice blow, lays on the surface of the sand, and that dries out and becomes spice. That's the spice, that the geriatric spice that clears the mind, gives you mental abilities, makes you young and beautiful. It's worm shit. Paul was going to take all the water in the sieges and flood the nests of sand trout and kill the worms, kill the makers. No more makers, no more spice. Spice is over. So that was the way he was going to control spice production. And now the Guild knew that. The Bene Gesserit knew that. Nobody else knew that, except for the Fremen. That's what made the Fremen dangerous. And so when Paul threatens this, most of the Landsraad's like, all right, kill the worms. We've been trying to do that for years. And the Guild is like, don't do that. And so, like, that was such a huge chess piece. That was the queen. That's when you take you take the queen. That's a big move. And so like all that wasn't there. All that wasn't there. So the fact that Paul was willing to break the CHOAM agreement and use atomics when no one else was allowed to, and they kind of touch on it, but not the why. The fact that lasers and shields cause basically atomic explosions, not really touched upon either. They use lasers constantly in the movie. The fact that the gender norms weren't there. The fact that Chani really just sort of wasn't Chani. The fact that Liet wasn't Liet, and therefore Paul did not fill the void of Liet. The fact that the weirding way wasn't a part of it. So much of what the film used, there were pieces of loyalty, but it didn't have the why that gave it substance and meaning. And so it was just kind of there. Lady Fenring, fucking Fade, is part of the film. It's a part of the book, and it's part of the film. But we don't know why that matters, ultimately. We don't know why they wanted to preserve the bloodline when we find out that Paul and Jessica have Harkonnen DNA. And that's the other thing that kind of bugged me. Why was it so important that the Kwisatz Haderach was a man? And this is where, unfortunately, the misogyny of Frank Herbert comes into play. And I do understand the change, but it's not what he wrote. Women who became Reverend Mothers and took the water of life, which is exactly what the Bene Gesserit did. They got worm puke and water of life, convert the poison. It connects them to genetic memory. Frank was pushing this idea that your DNA has the ability to unlock all the life experiences and life memories of everyone who was ever in your lineage, going backwards. And women could only see their female lineage. They could not delve into the memories of the men. So they only got 50% of it. And that was sort of the drawback of... It was based on the concept of DNA. Women have XX chromosomes, so they can only have half of it. Men have XY, and supposedly that was the reason men could get all the memories. You needed access to the Y chromosome, which women don't have. They have two X's, and we have an X and a Y, and that made men that's why men were the stronger, gender, if you will. And it's all bullshit, but it's what Frank wrote. And so when Paul's mother in the film says, "Oh, well, I learned my lineage when I took the water of life." Bullshit. The whole thing was she never knew who her father was because the Bene Gesserit kept that shit hidden from them. Because they would arrange who would have the kid, just like they did with Lady Fenring, but they would never tell the kids who their parents were. Surprise, surprise, who Jessica's mother is, too. I'm not going to spoil that, just in case they use it, but I doubt they will. But what's really crazy was the whole point of the Kwisatz Haderach was he was a male Reverend Mother, but he had access to female lineage and male lineage. And much like the Genghis Khan joke, where Genghis Khan has like 5,000 or 5 million descendants or something like that now, going back so far, and again, the Atreides were supposed to be descendant of like Alexander the Great and things like that, because they were Greek. The Kwisatz Haderach had perfect memory for all of eternity, going backwards, which gave him such an insight into patterns and predictability that perfect memory gave him perfect predictability. They called him the fulcrum of fate because he could see how choices in the past would play out and how they would influence each other. And it gave him the ability to determine what essentially was going to happen in the future. He could see all the possible futures. There was no surprising him. Nothing could be a surprise anymore. And so he said that when he discovered fate, he was trapped by it because he had no free will anymore. He understood what every choice he ever made would ever do, and what every choice every other person could make could do. And he could see all the branches all at once, kind of like Dr. Manhattan. He saw time as one thing rather than a linear thing. And so that was something only a man could do. And they were breeding a mind that could handle that kind of knowledge. And that was the whole point of the Bene Gesserit breeding program. So we end up with these failed Kwisatz Haderachs like Fenring and like Fade Routha. Fade Routha was a psychotic nut job. Well, that was part of the reason he couldn't handle all that stuff. That's later revisited by Brian when Paolo takes the super spice and sort of just turns into a drooling idiot because his brain is too advanced and he can't handle it. So that was like Paul's thing. And what happened with Alia, his sister, awakened to consciousness in the womb, she tries to take the same power that Paul has, but she only has half of it. She's still a woman. She can't do it. And ultimately, the Bene Gesserit fear that that's what they call an abomination when the Reverend Mother says that at the end of the movie. The point of that is if you are preborn, which is what that is, and you're awakened to consciousness in the womb, the likelihood that all the voices in your head, all the personalities that you remember and in a way are, that one would rise up to quiet all the rest and sort of possess you, and you would become that bastardized personality, and that sort of makes you an abomination. And that's what the Bene Gesserit test for. They do the trial of abomination to make sure you haven't gone apeshit. And some Reverend Mothers do succumb to that and have to be killed. And that's kind of what happens to Alia. That's not really, that's not a spoiler. That's been done so many times in various adaptations and stuff. But, Alia, them just saying abomination has no context in the movie whatsoever. And that kind of sucks. I didn't care that they took out Paul's first son. Paul has a son with Cheney, and then that son is killed during the destruction of Siege Tabar. That's fine. It didn't bug me. I don't think ultimately that had a huge impact on the story other than it sent Paul into a frenzy. But he kind of got there anyway. Fine enough. But I do have an issue with the fact that when they use the voice on everybody and it works, the voice didn't work on everybody. Certain people were conditioned and trained so that the voice did not work on them. And I dislike that the voice was a superpower that just worked on everybody. It's not really how that works. And that was somewhat problematic. Because then it becomes, well, why didn't you use the voice to solve every problem? If you're fighting somebody, why not be like, fall on your sword? And then they just kill themselves. So it's kind of bullshit. Similarly, I think that it would have been nice to see Paul have to inherit the responsibility of Jameis's wife. When Paul killed Jameis, he inherited his wife and child. 2 children. 3 children? I forgot. And that woman was bitching and moaning all the time. She was like, I'm still young and hot. Somebody might still want me. He doesn't even want me. This is crap, Stilgar. Don't make me work for him. And Paul took care of that people in his family, but they were bound to him at one point. And that was kind of an interesting little side thing about the gender norms of that society. So that all got cut out. And I just feel like so much of the why was missing in Denis' interpretation of Dune that it's Dune light. It's diet Dune. And it's great. It was palatable. It was great film. Like, just from a film point of view, it was great. But when you know that you had this much source material and you didn't use any of it, I mean, I think he used about 40% of what Frank had written. It was mostly surface level stuff. It was, it did sort of leave fans of the book to be like, oh, there was so much there you didn't use that would have made this so great. And the joke was he had the time because the Dune miniseries was about 5 to 6 hours on the Sci-Fi Channel. Denis' 2 films are 5 hours. Actually, a little longer then. So you had the time. The same time the Sci-Fi Channel did, and they got all of it in. Granted, a lot of the effects and the fight scenes were not as dramatic as a result. But you could have. And I think that's where a lot of the book readers are going to push back on Denis' version and be like, Apocalypse Dune was great, but you didn't read the book, bro. And I have that problem where, I wish Denis read the book. But I also don't bump into it in the same way that everybody else is bumping into it, because you know what? He ultimately didn't have to. He made a great movie with what pieces of Dune he had, and that's fine. I like Terry Goodkind's The Sword of Truth books. Well, some of them. But I loved Legend of the Seeker. Is Legend of the Seeker a good adaptation of the books? No! But is it an adaptation that is ultimately extremely palatable and a great show with great writing and great acting and great effects and great cast? Yes! Does it have to be Sword of Truth just because it's adapted from it? No! And neither does this Dune need to be Frank Herbert's Dune. Frank Herbert's Dune was written in the 60s. There's nothing wrong with taking that and saying, I can make a really great couple of movies out of this. Do they have to make something that Frank Herbert would have liked? No, they don't. They have to make something that we will like. That's what the point of a movie is. And he did it in spades. He did it in spades. So the end of my very long rant and review of Dune is, if you like Dune, you'll be able to fill in the blanks that Denis does not and enjoy the movie. If you know nothing about Dune, they are not going to bog you down with a bunch of science fiction that will make your head spin, and you'll like the movie. There is something for everybody in these movies. I think that there's a reason it's the highest rated IMDb movie, that it's critically acclaimed. It's probably going to win a bunch of Oscars and stuff. I think it's a great movie. I think it's a great collective series of films. And whatever he does with Dune Messiah, I'm down for it and I'll watch it. I love Dune, and I'm really happy that it's so popular and it's made Dune popular. And ultimately, some people will come to the books. Some people will not get the books. It'll be too different from the movie for them. They'll be like, this is boring. Other people will come to it, like it, and Dune will continue on through time, and that's great. So yeah, I still love the movie. I loved the cinematography of it. I love the design. Such cool props, such cool costumes. I think it turned into a little bit too much of a fashion show with the ladies, for my taste. Felt a little Luc Besson to me with some of that, but he is French Canadian, so I guess I do understand why the women have to be a walking nightmare of a fashion show. But you know what? Ultimately, it makes for great visuals, and it's pretty cool. And I do think a lot of covering the women's faces was a little bit of reflective of how society caged and oppressed them. And so I think Denis did get why these things were happening. And he did try to showcase them subtly in the film without putting them so front and center. And that's cool. That's okay. You can do that. Ultimately, he had to make his version that would be a hit. How do you take something that's a very polarizing book with polarizing topics that basically points a mirror at society and says, you shit on women, and that charismatic leaders destroy society and people, and religion is stupid? How do you take that and say it's nothing more than a source to manipulate people for power and advance one's political agenda? How do you make that something that everybody roots and cheers for? Well, this is how. He did it. He did it just fine. No one's going to sit there and look at Paul and say, oh, Trump or Kim Jong-un. No one's going to say that, but that's exactly what he's comparing him to. That's what Paul is. And that's hard for people to digest. Like, no, Timothy's my boy. He's my hero. Yay, I'm going to dress up like Timothy. He's a great character. He's Trump. That's what he's trying to tell us in the books. Paul is Trump. It's the dangers of charismatic leadership, which ultimately lead to total abuse of power, total manipulation, and when political manipulation doesn't work, you incorporate religion for the ultimate manipulation of power, which is very much seen in cults like Scientology and things like that. And you've seen charismatic leaders use religion time and time again to gain power and authority. You've seen people like David Miscavige, and these things. And so, again, it's very touchy to make that a successful movie, and you have to sort of cut that out as much as you can and distill it down to just the sci-fi stuff and make it a good war movie. And no wonder he used Apocalypse Now as a template. There were very deep underlying themes in Apocalypse Now about the horrors of war, but most people who watch that film just think it's a cool war movie. And so I understand the template. I really do. And it worked very successfully, and the films are great. They are great. They are great designs. They are great props. And they're not the books, but I guess they're never going to be. And if you really like the books, you still have the sci-fi miniseries, which is still my favorite. Get the director's cut or the European version. That's the definitive version, in my opinion. But I like this version just fine, and I'm happy to have it coexist with the other versions that I like. Make more. Do all the versions. I'm happy for it, So, in terms of a movie, dude, it's a 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10. Like, you can't ask for more than a movie. In terms of being a movie about the novel, it's like a 6 out of 10. I just don't bump into the fact that he didn't use the book because he did a good job with what he did use, and I'm okay with that. When I was younger, I would have cared more. But I'm good with it. So thanks for watching this very long rant. It's not as long as my Snyder Cut bitch fest, but I will say that I really enjoyed this film. I think you would too. Go check it out if you get a chance, and watch it on the theater if you can, assuming you don't have to pee. If you do have to pee, I recommend doing it during the scene where Paul has to ride the sandworm. That footage is already out. You can watch that before you go into the movie theater, and that'd be a great time to go pee. Other than that, yeah, I can't wait to see what he does with part 3. Hopefully one day all the extra footage he cut out will be released by Warner Brothers, whether Denis wants to release it or not. I think they don't want to piss him off until they get their 3rd movie, but once that's done, I would not be surprised if all that footage does come out in a super version later, just like all the Blade Runner footage and stuff like that. But yeah, man. I think it's rock and roll, and it's exactly what you want out of a movie theater movie. So check it out. Thumbs up for Dune.